She gave herself to her best friend's father. A forbidden and hot love. There are lines we promise ourselves we will never cross. The line between right and wrong, between a best friend and her father. Before we begin this story that will ignite your senses, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Now take a deep breath. The ballroom of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel was not merely a room, it was a living fantasy, a masterpiece of golden light and hushed opulence. Every detail, from the impossibly high ceilings to the polished marble underfoot, was designed to make its occupants feel as if they had stepped out of reality and into a waking dream. Gossamer fabrics of light organza were draped from gilded fixtures, floating like captive clouds under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. In every corner, towering arrangements of white orchids released a subtle, intoxicating perfume into the air, a scent of pure, unadulterated luxury. An impeccably dressed orchestra, nestled on a low stage, filled the vast space with a melody of strings so lush and evocative it seemed to slow time itself, wrapping the evening in a cocoon of sophisticated sound. In the midst of this curated perfection stood Eleonora Lancaster. She adjusted the delicate emerald strap of her silk dress, the cool, smooth fabric a stark contrast to the nervous energy buzzing just beneath her skin. This was it. The culmination of years of sleepless nights, of sacrificing social events for study sessions, of pushing herself to the absolute brink. Tonight, she would officially graduate from UCLA Law, a summit that, on the darkest nights surrounded by mountains of textbooks, had felt impossibly distant. Her reflection in the ornate mirror showed a young woman on the precipice of her future, her dark hair swept up elegantly, revealing the long line of her neck, her eyes, usually so serious and analytical, shining with a mixture of pride and profound anxiety. Beside her, a whirlwind of radiant energy, was Isabel Sterling, her best friend, her sister in all but blood since the first chaotic day of university. Isabel was a vision of pure, unadulterated joy. Her laughter, easy and frequent, echoed the carefree spirit of the California sun she so perfectly embodied. Tonight, in a dress the color of champagne, she shimmered, her smile a beacon of light. Isabel was life, optimism, and an open heart. And Eleonora had always been her anchor, the observer who walked in the quiet spaces between the light and the shadows, her own dreams and fears held close, like secrets. "Can you believe it, Ellie?" Isabel breathed, her eyes sparkling. "We actually did it. We survived." Eleonora managed a genuine smile. "We did. Today was a day for celebration, a day to close one chapter and begin another." That is what she believed, with every fiber of her being, until she saw him. He entered the ballroom not with a grand announcement, but with a shift in the very atmosphere of the room. It was as if the air itself grew heavier, more charged. Damian Sterling, Isabel's father. Until this exact moment, he had existed in Eleonora's life as a concept more than a man, a respected, admired, almost mythical figure, a name spoken in tones of awe in legal circles, a photograph on the mantelpiece in the Sterling mansion, a polite, distant figure at holiday parties past. But the man who stood across the room tonight was no myth. He was a titan. He was the kind of man who commanded attention not with noise or ostentation, but with an unnerving, potent stillness. As the founding partner of Sterling & Associates, the most powerful and feared law firm in Los Angeles, he hadn't just built a career, he had forged an empire through sheer force of will, strategic genius, and what was rumored to be a predator's instinct for weakness. His life from the outside had always seemed flawless, a fortress of success and control, until it wasn't. Months ago, the fortress had shown its first crack. After a marriage of 25 years that had seemed as permanent and iconic as the Hollywood sign, Damian and Isabel's mother announced their separation. There were no messy tabloid stories, no public fights, only a chilling, impenetrable silence that spoke of a wound far deeper than any shouting match could inflict. In the aftermath, Damian had retreated. He vanished from the society pages, from the charity galas, from the world he had so masterfully commanded. When he re-emerged weeks later, the man who returned was different. The polished, almost aloof charm was gone, replaced by something harder, sharper. He was more solitary, his eyes holding a new depth, a shadow of something that looked like pain but felt like danger. And it was this Damien, this new, formidable creature that Eleonora saw tonight. He moved through the crowd with a restrained, predatory grace, a panther in a bespoke Tom Ford suit. The dark fabric was tailored to perfection, hinting at the powerful physique beneath. His dark hair, now threaded with distinguished silver at the temples, was artfully disheveled, a subtle rebellion against the rigid control he was known for. But it was his eyes that ensnared her. They were the color of a storm cloud, deep and unsettling. They were eyes that didn't just see. They pierced, they assessed, they claimed, and then they found her. Across the expanse of marble and music, Damien's gaze landed on Eleonora. It wasn't a casual glance. It wasn't the polite acknowledgement of his daughter's friend. It was a moment of pure, unnerving recognition, a magnetic pull so strong it felt physical. Time didn't just slow down, it ceased to exist. In that single searing moment, he didn't see a young graduate. He didn't see the girl who had spent countless hours studying in his library. His eyes locked onto hers as if he were seeing a woman, the woman for the very first time, and in his gaze she saw a reflection of something she had never known was inside her, a raw, elemental power that matched his own. Eleonora's breath hitched, trapped in her throat. A scorching heat, sudden and fierce, flooded her veins, prickling at her skin. The beautiful silk dress that had felt so perfect moments ago now felt too tight, too constricting, a cage for her suddenly racing heart. For an instant that stretched into an eternity, the world around her, the music, the laughter, the golden light, dissolved into an indistinct blur. She forgot where she was, who she was. There was only the dizzying, terrifying intensity of his stare. With a monumental effort, she broke the connection, her head snapping toward Isabel, a frantic smile plastered on her face. "He's here," she managed to say, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "Oh, good, I was wondering where he was," Isabel said, blissfully unaware of the silent cataclysm that had just occurred. Eleonora dared a glance back. Damien was accepting a glass of whiskey from a passing waiter, his movements smooth and controlled. The world started to spin again, but the feeling of his gaze lingered, a physical weight on her back, a searing brand on her skin. He was still watching her, and she, my God, she felt it. She felt every cell in her body awaken and stand at attention under that dark, possessive gaze. She felt the sudden, shocking thrill of the prohibition. She felt the immediate, crushing weight of guilt. She felt the sheer, exhilarating insanity of the moment, and a terrifying, powerful surge of desire that rose from the very core of her being. It was madness. It was wrong on every conceivable level. And yet, it was the most real, the most profound thing she had ever felt in her entire life. Later, on stage, as her name was called, Eleonora moved as if in a trance. She accepted her diploma, shook the dean's hand, and smiled for the flashing cameras. But as she stood there, bathed in the applause, she allowed her eyes to scan the audience, a moth drawn to a dangerous flame. She found him instantly. He was standing near the back, leaning against a marble column, his drink held loosely in one hand. He wasn't clapping. He was simply watching her, his expression unreadable, his gaze unwavering. And she knew. In that moment, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, she knew this story, whatever it was, had just begun. In that silent, forbidden exchange, a line had been irrevocably crossed. There was no turning back. Throughout the rest of the night, his gaze became a recurring touch, a secret language only they understood. It would find her when she was talking to a professor, when she was laughing with a group of friends, when she was simply standing alone trying to catch her breath. It was magnetic, deliberate, and it sent a jolt through her every single time. To everyone else in the room, he was simply a proud father, watching over the celebration. But to Eleonora, the air between them was charged, electric, thick with unspoken words and dangerous possibilities. She felt seen in a way she had never been seen before. She felt desired. And the most frightening part was the illicit thrill that shot through her with every searing glance. Isabel, ever the buoyant socialite, appeared at her side again, her eyes shining with a new idea. "I've just had the most brilliant thought," she declared, grabbing Eleonora's hand, her touch grounding her for a moment. "We have to celebrate properly. Forget all this stuffy formality. Let's go to my dad's beach house in Malibu. A few days of peace, just us girls, before we have to put on suits and conquer the legal world." Eleonora's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Malibu, his house. The words echoed in her mind. The idea was both a terrifying warning and an irresistible invitation. To be in his space, his sanctuary. It was a thought that made her feel both faint and fiercely alive. "Oh, Izzy, I don't know," she started, her mind scrambling for a plausible excuse. "I have so much to do packing my parents." "Nonsense!" Isabel waved her hand dismissively, her cheerful persistence an unstoppable force. "Your parents will understand. You deserve this, Ellie. We deserve this." From across the room, Eleonora could feel Damien watching them. His expression was still unreadable, a mask of cool indifference. But she knew. She knew he had heard. She knew he was waiting for her answer. His stillness was a challenge, a dare. Later, in the car on the way home, as the glittering lights of Los Angeles streaked past the window, Eleonora knew the night wasn't over. It was only the beginning, the graduation, the accolades, they were all just a prelude. A storm was coming, a storm of emotion and desire she had never anticipated, and its name was Damien Sterling. The drive along the Pacific Coast Highway the next afternoon was a study in contrasts. Outside the car, the world was a masterpiece of vibrant life, the California sun casting a diamond-like shimmer across the vast, impossibly blue expanse of the ocean. The salty air, thick with the scent of sea spray and blooming bougainvillea, whipping through the open windows. Inside the car, however, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of energy, a quiet, humming tension that Eleonora felt in the very marrow of her bones. Isabel, in the driver's seat, chattered with her usual infectious enthusiasm, her words painting a brilliant picture of their immediate future. She spoke of late-night study sessions finally paying off, of the intimidating partners they would soon be working for, of the chic apartments they would rent, and the life that was just waiting for them to claim it. Eleonora listened, nodding and smiling at all the right moments, her voice a soft murmur of agreement. But her mind was miles away, caught in a turbulent current of anticipation and dread. Her gaze was fixed on the white lines of the highway as they disappeared hypnotically beneath the wheels, each one pulling her closer to a destination that felt less like a vacation and more like a reckoning. With every mile that passed, the image of Damien Sterling superimposed itself over the breathtaking coastal scenery. His eyes, the color of a gathering storm, were a more potent force than the Pacific itself. The memory of his gaze from the night before was a physical presence, a heat that lingered at the base of her neck, a silent pressure against her skin. She found herself replaying each stolen glance, dissecting them, searching for meaning in the unnerving intensity she had seen there. Was it just a fleeting moment of admiration? Or was it something more, something deeper, something far more dangerous? The uncertainty was a knot in her stomach, tightening with every turn of the road. When Isabel finally swerved off the main highway and onto a discreet private road, the change was immediate. The roar of the traffic faded, replaced by the crunch of gravel under the tires. Towering cypress trees lined the path, their dark green foliage forming a natural tunnel that felt both exclusive and isolating. The sunlight filtered through the dense branches in shifting patterns, dappling the road ahead. Eleonora felt her stomach clench. This was it, the point of no return. The trees gave way to an open bluff, and the view that unfolded before them was so spectacular it stole the breath from her lungs. The sea appeared first, an intense, almost violent shade of blue, breaking into pristine white foam against the rugged, sun-bleached rocks below. And then she saw the house. It wasn't just a house, it was a work of art, a modern marvel of light-stained wood and vast walls of glass that seemed to emerge organically from the hillside. It didn't dominate the landscape. It submitted to it, embraced by the constant caress of the wind and the eternal rhythmic sound of the waves. A wide, multi-level wooden deck wrapped around the entire structure, dotted with minimalist furniture that invited one to sit and be swallowed by the view. Enormous windows, many of them open to the sea breeze, promised interiors flooded with natural light. It was a place of serene, almost spiritual beauty. And yet, as they pulled into the driveway, Eleonora felt as if she were stepping onto the threshold of the most dangerous place on earth. "We're here," Isabel announced, cutting the engine. She kicked off her sandals the moment she stepped out of the car, her bare feet sinking into the warm, sandy gravel with a childish laugh. "Isn't it heaven?" Eleonora forced a smile, her own joy muted by a wave of apprehension. "It's breathtaking, Izzy." Her smile froze on her lips when she saw him. He was waiting on the deck, Damien. But this was a Damien she had never seen before, a version of him stripped of all his corporate armor. He was barefoot, the cuffs of his simple linen shorts rolled up to his knees. A light-colored t-shirt stretched across the broad, powerful expanse of his chest and shoulders. His dark hair, free from any product, was wild and tousled by the sea breeze, the silver strands at his temples catching the afternoon sun. The image was so absurdly, devastatingly casual that it felt like a carefully laid trap. The contrast between this relaxed, almost primal man and the titan of industry she knew was dizzying. He was holding a bottle of water and speaking quietly into his phone, his back partially to them. But upon noticing their arrival, he ended the call with a clipped word and slipped the phone into his pocket. He turned, and his eyes found hers, instantly. The look he gave her wasn't long, it wasn't blatant, but it hit her with the force of a physical touch. It was a glance of pure possession, a silent acknowledgement of the charge that had been ignited between them the night before. It said, "You're here. I knew you would come." Eleonora's body reacted before her mind could catch up. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot through her. She quickly averted her eyes, pretending to be captivated by the house's architecture, her fingers tightening on the strap of her overnight bag. Isabel, oblivious, ran up the steps to the deck. "Dad!" she cried, throwing her arms around him in a tight hug. "The house is perfect for a post-grad escape." Damien smiled then, a genuine, if reserved smile that softened the hard lines of his face for a fleeting moment. He returned his daughter's hug with a strength that spoke of a deep, if complicated, love. Eleonora remained by the car, fumbling with her bag, suddenly unsure of what to do with her own hands. And then he approached. He moved with that same unhurried, graceful power she had noticed the night before, each step deliberate and sure. "Eleonora," he said, his voice a deep, velvety rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. It was both an invitation and a threat. She forced herself to lift her head, her eyes meeting his. They were even more intense in the bright light of day, dense and impenetrable, pulling her in. "Thank you for coming," he said, the politeness of his words laced with an unspoken, razor-sharp intensity. Eleonora managed a small, tight smile. "It was an invitation that was hard to refuse," she replied, her voice remarkably steady, despite the tremor that had started deep inside her. Damien tilted his head slightly, a subtle gesture, but his eyes gleamed with a knowing light. He knew exactly what she wasn't saying. He knew this was no ordinary weekend getaway. The moment was broken by Isabel, who grabbed Eleonora by the hand, her energy a welcome buffer. "Come on, I'll show you your room. It has the best view, I promise." Eleonora allowed herself to be led away, but she could feel Damien's presence etched onto her skin like an invisible tattoo. They climbed a floating wooden staircase to the second floor, where hallways of glass and wood led to bedrooms that all seemed to open directly to the ocean. Eleonora's room was a sanctuary of simple elegance, a large bed with crisp white linens, light curtains dancing with the breeze, and the constant soothing sound of the waves filling the space like a lullaby. She dropped her bag and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Down below on the deck, Damien was walking slowly along the railing, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He seemed to carry the weight of an invisible world on his shoulders, a world of responsibility, of loss, of secrets, and somehow, in a way she couldn't explain, Eleonora felt that a part of that weight was now hers to bear as well. Later, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink, they gathered for dinner. The table was set on the wooden deck, overlooking the darkening ocean. The meal was simple, a large fresh salad, grilled shrimp, and warm artisanal bread. The simplicity felt more intimate, more unnerving than any fancy restaurant. Isabel, lively and effervescent, carried the conversation, telling funny stories from their college days, anecdotes that drew brief, short smiles from her father. Eleonora, however, could barely swallow her food. She had chosen a seat facing the sea, a strategic move that unfortunately placed Damien at the head of the table, directly in her peripheral vision. She felt his gaze land on her occasionally, not staring, but observing, like a connoisseur studying a rare and dangerous piece of art. She felt her own body's traitorous response, a slow, creeping heat rising through her skin, the blood pulsing in places deep inside her, places she didn't even know could pulse with such insistent life. She tried to focus on the conversation, tried to laugh at Isabel's jokes, tried to be the same old Ellie, but that girl was gone, and Damien was no longer just Isabel's distant, imposing father. There was something new in him, a furious containment, a coiled tension that seemed to vibrate in the salty air between them. When dinner ended, Isabel stretched and yawned. "I'm going to bed early tonight. I'm wiped out from the party." She gave them both a quick wave and disappeared inside. The sudden silence she left behind was deafening. Damien began to collect the empty plates, and Eleonora, on pure, unthinking instinct, got up to help him. In the kitchen, the silence pressed in, thick and heavy, broken only by the soft, rhythmic crash of the waves against the shore. The room was sleek and modern, all stainless steel and dark wood, but it felt intensely intimate. As Eleonora reached to hand Damien a plate, their fingers brushed. The shock was immediate, violent. A shiver, sharp as a shard of ice, ran up her spine, and she almost dropped the plate. Her eyes, wide with shock, flew to his. Damien caught the plate effortlessly, his gaze never leaving hers. For a single, searing second that seemed to contain an entire lifetime, they stood there motionless, trapped in the current arcing between them, breathing the same air, feeling the same impossible fire ignite. His eyes darkened, the pupils dilating, and she saw in their depths a flash of the same raw hunger she felt inside herself. And then, with a visible effort that made a muscle in his jaw clench, he pulled away, breaking the spell. "Good night, Eleonora," he said, his voice low and hoarse, thick with all the words he could not, would not, say. Eleonora could only nod, her throat too tight to form words. She fled up the stairs to her room, her steps trembling. She closed the door and pressed her forehead against the cool, smooth wood, her eyes squeezed shut. The sea roared outside. The wind howled like a warning. But it was inside her that the real storm was beginning to rage, and for the first time, with a certainty she could no longer deny, she knew this trip, this house, this man, would change everything. The storm was no longer coming. It was here, and for the first time in her life, she knew she had no desire to seek shelter. Sleep did not come easily. Eleonora lay in the vast, comfortable bed, but her body was a live wire, humming with a restless, unfamiliar energy. The sound of the ocean, which should have been soothing, felt like the deep, rhythmic breathing of a slumbering beast. Every crash of the waves against the shore seemed to echo the frantic, chaotic beating of her own heart. She tossed and turned in the crisp white linens, the memory of that single electrifying touch in the kitchen replaying in her mind on an endless loop. It had been nothing, a fleeting, accidental brush of skin, and yet it had felt like everything. It was a spark in a room filled with gasoline, a silent, damning confession of the combustible energy that arced between them. She finally drifted into a fitful sleep, her dreams a tangled, feverish montage of storm-colored eyes, the scent of salt and whiskey, and the phantom sensation of a strong, warm hand closing over hers. When she awoke, the first light of dawn was painting the sky in soft hues of lavender and pale gold. The house was still, wrapped in the pre-dawn hush. For a moment, in the groggy space between sleep and waking, she felt a sense of peace. Then the full weight of where she was and who she was with came crashing down on her. Damien. He was just a floor below, perhaps already awake, and the thought sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her system, chasing away the last vestiges of sleep. The smell of fresh coffee, rich and dark, was the first thing she noticed as she descended the stairs an hour later. It mixed with the salty aroma of the morning breeze that drifted in through the open glass doors, creating an atmosphere that was dangerously, deceptively domestic. Eleonora descended the floating wooden staircase slowly, her bare feet silent on the cool, smooth wood. Each step felt deliberate, echoing the indecisive, heavy beat of her heart. She had hastily chosen a simple, light sundress, its soft fabric feeling weightless as it brushed against her bare legs, doing little to hide the tingling awareness of her own skin, of her own body that had been awakened within her. He was at the long wooden dining table alone. His head was down, his intense focus directed at the phone in his hand. A half-empty coffee cup was held loosely in his other hand, his posture one of complete immersion in another world, a world of business, of strategy, of power. But the instant Eleonora's foot touched the last step, his head snapped up, and the world stopped. It wasn't a slow, deliberate gesture. It wasn't a blatant insinuation. It was a reflex, an instinct, a predator sensing a change in its environment. His eyes, clear and sharp in the morning light, locked onto hers. And in that look, there was something raw, something almost primitive, that made Eleonora's stomach clench into a tight, aching knot. It was the look of a man who had been waiting, a man who knew she was coming. She quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing with heat. She moved toward the sleek modern kitchen counter, her movements feeling stiff and unnatural. She poured herself a mug of coffee, concentrating on the simple task with an intensity it didn't deserve, willing her hands not to tremble, but she could feel his gaze on her, a tangible heat tracing the line of her spine, as if he could see straight through the thin fabric of her dress, straight through the careful mask of composure she was so desperately trying to wear. "Good morning." His voice was a low rumble, cutting through the comfortable silence of the morning with a gravity that seemed out of place. It was too intimate, too resonant. "Good morning," she replied, her own voice sounding surprisingly steady, though nothing inside her felt steady. Nothing felt natural. Isabel appeared a few moments later, a whirlwind of sunny, carefree energy that was both a blessing and a curse. She was a welcome buffer against the suffocating tension, but her innocence also served to highlight the illicit nature of the current flowing between Eleonora and her father. "Morning, you two," she chirped, grabbing a slice of artisan toast and sitting down at the table, placing herself physically and metaphorically between them. "I was thinking," she said through a mouthful of food, "that we could spend the entire day on the beach. Just relax, read, do absolutely nothing. The weather is perfect." Eleonora nodded, grateful for the intervention, for the easy, normal conversation. "Sounds amazing," she agreed, her voice still a little tight. Damien remained silent, lifting his coffee cup to his lips with the calculated, unhurried calm of a man accustomed to controlling everything, his empire, his environment, and most of all his own formidable impulses. But Eleonora saw the subtle tension in the set of his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the ceramic mug, just a little too tightly. He was not as unaffected as he appeared. As Eleonora reached for a small plate for a pastry, Damien moved with a swift, surprising fluidity. He intercepted her movement, sliding a clean plate directly in front of her. The gesture was simple, an act of mundane politeness, but as he did so, the backs of his fingers deliberately, unmistakably, brushed against hers. The contact was brief, lighter than a whisper, but the effect was like a lit match to gasoline. A dry, searing heat shot up Eleonora's arm, exploding in a cascade of tiny shivers that raced across her skin. She almost dropped the plate, a small, startled gasp escaping her lips, but his hand was there instantly, his fingers closing over hers for a fraction of a second to steady it, his eyes locked onto hers, and in that fleeting moment, the world narrowed to the few inches of space between them. It was a silent, charged conversation, a question, a confession, a dare. Eleonora pulled her hand back as if burned, her face flushing a deep, betraying shade of crimson. She busied herself with her food, with Isabel's cheerful chatter about a new surfing documentary she had watched, with the hypnotic sound of the waves crashing outside. Anything to pull her away from the screaming awareness of her own body, of the blood that was suddenly running too hot and too fast in her veins. "He's Isabel's father," she chanted in her mind, a frantic, useless mantra against the roaring fire he had so effortlessly ignited within her. Isabel's father. Isabel's father. But the words were hollow, meaningless. Her body wasn't listening. Her body knew the truth. It recognized the contained hunger in his every restrained gesture, the unspoken desire in his measured, careful words. It was a desire as wrong as it was inevitable. And it terrified her, because for the first time in her controlled, disciplined life, she felt that same wild, reckless desire roaring back inside her. After breakfast, Isabel announced she was going to take a quick shower before heading to the beach. She ran up the stairs, leaving them alone once again. The silence that fell in her absence was deafening, thick with unspoken things. Eleonora began to clear the dishes, her movements quick and efficient, a desperate attempt to create a sense of normalcy. Damien stayed, leaning against the counter, watching her. As she reached for the last large platter, he moved to take it at the same time. Their hands met, skin against skin, fingers tangling together over the cool ceramic. This time, it was no accident. This time, neither of them pulled away. Eleonora held her breath, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She could feel the warmth of his hand, the subtle strength in his fingers, the slightly rough texture of his skin against hers. She lifted her eyes to his and found them burning into her, dark and intense. He was no longer hiding it. The desire was there, raw and undisguised, a silent, powerful claim. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to take every ounce of his legendary self-control, he withdrew his hand, breaking the connection. The loss of his touch was a physical ache. "I'm going to get my things," Eleonora whispered, her voice strained and breathless. She fled the room without waiting for a reply, but she could feel his gaze on her back, a possessive, invisible touch that seemed to brand her as his. In the sanctuary of her room, she leaned her back against the closed door, her body trembling. She pressed her forehead against the cool, smooth wood, willing her heart to slow down, willing her mind to regain control. Lies. It was all lies. The excuses she was making, the tension, the exhaustion, the heat. What she had felt that morning in the kitchen was not her imagination. It was desire, raw, untamable, and catastrophically, beautifully real. And the worst part, the most terrifying and exhilarating part, was that he felt it too. She had seen it in his eyes, felt it in his touch. She saw it in the hard, rigid line of his jaw every time they were too close, the physical manifestation of his battle for control. The beach house was no longer a beautiful refuge. It was a gilded cage, a perfect sun-drenched trap, and she had walked right into it, willingly. Or perhaps she had been lured in all along. The afternoon sun was a relentless, brilliant force, beating down on the Malibu coastline and turning the golden sand to a shimmering, almost liquid gold. The heat was oppressive, a heavy blanket that seemed to amplify the simmering tension that had taken root in the house. Eleonora, desperate for a reprieve from both the external and internal fire, dove into the infinity pool without a second thought. The water was a shock to her system, a cool, silken embrace that momentarily silenced the frantic buzzing in her mind. She let her body go limp, floating on her back, her face turned up to the vast, cloudless sky. She closed her eyes, the sound of the water lapping gently around her ears, the distant cry of a seagull, the rhythmic crash of the waves against the shore. For a few precious moments, she tried to empty her mind, to forget everything but the sensation of weightlessness, of being held and suspended between the blue of the water and the blue of the sky. When she finally surfaced, gasping for air, she pushed her wet, heavy hair back from her face, water streaming down her temples and neck. And her eyes, as if drawn by an invisible, inexorable force, met his. He was on the deck, seated in the cool shade of the overhang. He held a forgotten bottle of water in one hand, condensation beading on the outside. He wasn't pretending to read or work on his phone. He was simply watching her. His gaze was no longer subtle, no longer a fleeting, stolen glance. It was direct, hot, intense, and undeniably possessive. It moved over her with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who knew exactly what he wanted and who was accustomed to getting it. This time, Eleonora didn't pretend not to notice. She held his gaze from across the crystalline water, her heart beginning to pound a heavy, resonant rhythm against her ribs. His stare was a physical touch, a caress that moved over her from afar. It was as if every shimmering drop of water that trickled down her skin, over her shoulders, down the curve of her collarbone, into the valley between her breasts, was being followed by his gaze, tracing invisible, scorching paths that left her entire body on fire. The simple, elegant black bikini she wore, once a comfortable and practical choice, now felt scandalously revealing. It seemed to expose not just her skin, but the very pulse that throbbed beneath it, the secret, shameful thrill that was coiling deep in her belly. Her skin, which had been cooled by the water just moments before, now burned under the sheer, unadulterated heat of his stare. It was the most intimate, most invasive sensation she had ever experienced, and it was happening in plain sight. Isabel was nearby, lying on a plush lounge chair, a large sun hat shielding her face. She was completely immersed in a book, her headphones blocking out the world, innocent of the silent, dangerous game of observation being played just meters away. Her presence was a constant, sharp reminder of the profound betrayal inherent in this simmering attraction, a fact that only seemed to heighten the illicit, forbidden nature of the desire that was arcing between Eleonora and her father. With a deep breath, Eleonora began to swim, her strokes long and powerful, slicing through the cool water in a desperate attempt to outrun the feeling of being so thoroughly claimed. But even as she moved, even as she put distance between them, she could feel his eyes on her, following her every movement, watching the play of muscles in her back, the kick of her legs, the arc of her arms. He was studying her, memorizing her, and she felt a strange, heady mix of vulnerability and power in being the sole focus of such intense masculine concentration. When she could swim no longer, she made her way to the steps at the shallow end of the pool. As she climbed out of the water, the impact of his gaze was even greater. She felt the soaked, heavy fabric of the bikini cling to her skin, outlining every curve, every contour, leaving nothing to the imagination. She felt the heat of the sun on her wet body, but it was nothing compared to the searing internal heat generated by his stare. He watched her every step as she walked across the warm wood of the deck to retrieve her towel. It was as if he were touching her without lifting a single finger, his eyes an intimate exploration of the water, dripping from the ends of her hair, the way the sun caught the droplets on her skin, the gentle sway of her hips. He was devouring her with his eyes, and a part of her, a reckless, shameless part she was only just beginning to discover, reveled in it. "It's so hot today," Isabel commented, finally looking up from her book and removing her headphones. Her voice, so normal and carefree, was a jarring intrusion into the supercharged atmosphere. "I'm going to get something to drink," Eleonora announced, her own voice sounding shaky and breathless to her ears. She needed to escape, to put a physical barrier between herself and the intensity of his gaze before her legs could betray her weakness. Inside the cool, dim kitchen, she leaned heavily against the smooth marble countertop, closing her eyes and pressing the heels of her hands against them as if she could physically block out the image of him. "This can't happen," she whispered to the empty room, the words a hollow, desperate plea. "It can't." But the wild, frantic pulse throbbing deep inside her, a secret, insistent drumbeat of desire, told her it already was. She took her time, rinsing a glass under the faucet with meticulous care, filling it with ice, pouring the water slowly. Every second was a small act of defiance against the magnetic pull that was drawing her back outside. When she had exhausted all possible delaying tactics, she took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and returned to the deck. He was standing now, his powerful silhouette outlined against the bright afternoon sun. He had moved to the edge of the deck, his back to her, looking out at the ocean. But the moment she stepped outside, he turned, as if he had sensed her presence, as if her very proximity was a physical force he could feel. The world seemed to shrink again, leaving only the two of them in that supercharged space. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a living, breathing thing that grew with every passing second, becoming heavier, more impossible to ignore. She moved to the lounge chair next to her friend, her movements stiff, her body screamingly aware of him just a few feet away. She tried to appear casual, to be just another girl on a sunny beach day, enjoying a quiet vacation. But it was a lie. She was no longer that girl. She had been fundamentally altered by the weight of his gaze, by the forbidden desire he had awakened in her, and she would never be the same again. The drive back to Los Angeles later that evening was thick with an unbearable, suffocating silence. Isabel, sensing the strange shift in mood but unable to diagnose its cause, chattered nervously about their upcoming first week at the firm, her words filling the void. But Eleonora was only aware of Damien in the driver's seat. His hands gripped the leather-wrapped steering wheel, his knuckles white. His jaw was tight, a hard, unforgiving line. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, his profile a stoic, impenetrable mask. But she could feel the storm of unspoken words hanging in the air between them, a palpable, dangerous energy. She could feel the fight he was waging with himself, the immense effort it was taking him not to look at her in the rearview mirror. When he finally pulled up in front of her modest Westwood apartment building, the sudden stillness was almost as jarring as the tension had been. Isabel leaned over from the back seat and hugged her tightly. "I'll see you Monday. I can't wait. We are going to take over the world, you and I," she said with a bright smile. "Try to get some rest. You seem tired." "I will," Eleonora promised, her own smile feeling thin and brittle. Before she could open the car door and make her escape, his voice stopped her. "Eleonora." It was low, a deep, velvety growl that vibrated through the enclosed space of the car. She turned her head slowly, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. Her eyes met his in the rearview mirror. The mask was gone. In its place was the same raw, turbulent intensity she had seen at the party, the same possessive fire she had felt at the beach house. And again, everything inside her went still and silent. "I wanted to take this opportunity," he continued, his voice firm, deliberate, each word landing with calculated weight, "to make you a proposal." Isabel's eyes widened with innocent curiosity. "Ooh, a mystery, Dad," she teased, leaning forward between the front seats. Damien's gaze flickered to his daughter for a fleeting second, a hint of something unreadable in his eyes, before returning to Eleonora's reflection in the mirror. His focus was absolute, unwavering. "At the firm," he began, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate, more conspiratorial, "we have an opening, an associate position on my personal team. I thought of you." Eleonora was stunned into silence. Her mind reeled. His personal team? It was an unheard-of opportunity for a fresh graduate, a position that seasoned lawyers would kill for. It meant working directly under him, day in, day out. "Me," she murmured, the word barely a whisper. "You're brilliant," he stated, not as a compliment but as a simple, unassailable fact. "You're dedicated. Your mind is sharp. You see angles others miss." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "Isabel is starting with us in the corporate division. It would be an honor to have you both at the firm." Isabel squealed with delight, her excitement exploding in the confined space. "Oh my God, Ellie, say yes, please say yes. It would be absolutely perfect. We could commute together, have lunch. It would be amazing," she said, shaking Eleonora's arm in her enthusiasm. Perfect. The word hung in the air. It would be perfect torture. To be in his orbit every single day, to be subjected to that dangerous, crackling energy in every meeting, with every shared glance across a boardroom table. It would be like willingly choosing to walk through fire. Damien watched her in the mirror, his expression unreadable once more. But she knew. He knew exactly what he was offering. It wasn't just a job. It was a choice. It was a trap. And he knew exactly what he was risking by extending the invitation. I'll have to think about it," she managed to say, the words feeling inadequate, foolish. Isabel clapped her hands, laughing. "That's almost a yes. I'll take it," she exclaimed. Damien offered a small restrained smile, a smile that didn't reach his stormy eyes, a smile that seemed to contain the entire weight of their impossible situation. As Eleonora finally exited the car and walked into her building, she didn't have to look back. She could feel his eyes on her, a searing, possessive brand on her skin, following her until she was out of sight. In the cold, sterile silence of the elevator, she leaned her head against the cool metal wall and closed her eyes. And she finally admitted the truth to herself. Accepting his offer wasn't a career move. It was an act of surrender. It was a conscious decision to step into the heart of the inferno that burned between them. And deep down, in the most reckless, untamed corner of her soul, she knew she had already said yes. The Sterling & Associates building was not just a structure of smoked glass and steel. It was a testament to power, a formidable monument to ambition that pierced the grey morning sky of Century City. It loomed over the landscape, a silent, imposing declaration of the man who had built it. As Eleonora's heels clicked a soft, rhythmic staccato across the polished marble lobby, the sound seemed to echo the frantic, unsteady beating of her heart. It wasn't just first-day nerves, that familiar flutter of anxiety and anticipation. This was something else entirely. This was the trepidation of a soldier willingly walking onto a battlefield. This was him. The elevator ascended in an unnerving, gilded silence, the floors climbing with a smooth, inexorable glide. She watched the numbers light up, each one a step closer to the 35th floor, to his world, to the heart of the inferno. When the doors finally opened with a soft, expensive sigh, the space that greeted her was even more impressive than she had imagined. It wasn't the cold, sterile environment of a typical corporate law firm. This was a space curated with the same meticulous, intimidating elegance as the man who commanded it. Clean, minimalist lines of glass and brushed steel were warmed by rich, dark wood and soft, ambient lighting. It was a perfect, breathtaking balance of raw power and sophisticated grace. Isabel was already there to greet her, a beacon of sunshine in the intimidatingly beautiful reception area. Her smile was wide and genuine, her hug quick and warm. "Welcome to your new home," she said, her voice filled with an excitement that made Eleonora's guilt twist into a sharp, painful knot. "I can't believe this is real, us here together. We're going to be unstoppable." As Isabel led her on a tour down the main corridor, her cheerful voice pointing out the state-of-the-art conference rooms, the impressive law library, the sleek employee lounge, Eleonora barely registered the details. Her senses were on high alert, every nerve ending buzzing with a heightened awareness. Every soft footstep on the plush carpet, every quiet murmur of conversation from a nearby office seemed to herald his approach. Every step Isabel took beside her felt like it was pulling her deeper into the labyrinth, closer to the Minotaur at its center. And then she saw him. He was standing at the far end of the corridor, in front of a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a panoramic view of the sprawling city below. He was in conversation with one of the firm's senior partners, his posture radiating an effortless, absolute authority. He wore an impeccably tailored dark suit, the crisp white of his shirt a stark contrast to his tanned skin. His tie was perfectly knotted, a sliver of dark silk. He was the master of this universe, every inch the powerful, untouchable man the world knew him to be. The moment he lifted his eyes, and they locked with hers from across the long expanse of the hallway, the world around Eleonora stopped breathing. The senior partner continued to speak, but Damien's attention was no longer on him. His gaze was a physical touch, a hot, sharp, possessive claim that cut through the professional atmosphere and struck her deep in her core. For an instant that stretched for an eternity, they were trapped in that silent, loaded exchange, the rest of the world fading into an insignificant blur. It was a moment that said everything. "You came. You're here. You're mine." Isabel's cheerful voice, blissfully unaware, pulled them back from the brink. "Dad, look who's finally here to class up the joint," she called out, waving. The senior partner turned, a polite smile on his face. Damien's expression shifted, the raw intensity instantly masked by a cool, professional veneer. But the storm in his eyes still raged, a secret only Eleonora could see. He and the partner began to walk toward them, and with every closing step, Eleonora's heart hammered a more frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Eleonora," Damien said, his voice a smooth, deep baritone that held no trace of their shared history. "Welcome to the firm. We're glad to have you." He extended his hand. She placed her hand in his, and the contact was a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity, even more potent than it had been in the kitchen. His grip was firm, his skin warm. The handshake lasted a fraction of a second too long, his thumb brushing almost imperceptibly against the sensitive skin of her wrist. It was a tiny, secret act of possession in plain sight. "It's an honor to be here, Mr. Sterling," she replied, her voice steady, a testament to years of disciplined self-control. "Damien," he corrected her, just as the senior partner engaged Isabel in conversation. His voice was lower now, a murmur meant only for her. "In this office you will call me Damien." The command was soft, but the underlying message was as hard as steel. It was another claim, another way of separating her from everyone else. Later, as Eleonora was attempting to settle into her new office, a beautiful, spacious room with its own stunning view of the city, a quiet, deliberate knock on the door made her stomach lurch. It was him. He entered without waiting for an invitation, closing the door softly behind him, the quiet click of the latch sealing them off from the rest of the world. He leaned against the door for a moment, his arms crossed over his chest, just watching her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken words. "I just wanted to welcome you officially," he finally said, his deep voice a low, intimate vibration in the quiet room. Eleonora nodded, her own voice caught in her throat. She could only look at him, taking in the reality of him standing there, in her space, the forbidden man who was now her boss. He pushed off the door and walked slowly toward her desk. He didn't sit, but instead perched on the edge of it, his proximity immediately shrinking the large office, making the air feel thin and hard to breathe. "Are you nervous?" he asked, his gaze intense, searching. "A little," she admitted, the understatement of the century. A shadow of a smile, a slight knowing curve of his lips, touched his mouth. "Don't be. You belong here." The way he said it, the emphasis on the word belong, made it sound less like a reassurance and more like a declaration. The silence that followed was dense, a living thing. Eleonora knew what was hanging in the air between them, what was churning beneath the surface of this stilted, professional conversation. And he knew it too. Every word spoken, every word unspoken, every shared glance. It was all part of a dangerous, intricate dance they were just beginning to learn. Before leaving, he paused at the door, his hand on the handle. "If you need anything," he added without turning to look at her, "my office is at the end of the hall. The door is always open. For you." When he was gone, Eleonora sank into her chair, her body trembling with the aftershocks of his presence. This wasn't just a job. It had never been just a job. It was a cage, a playground, a battlefield, and it was far, far too late to pretend otherwise. The clock on the wall read nearly 6 in the evening. The sky outside had deepened to a bruised purple, the city lights beginning to twinkle to life below. Isabel had left an hour ago with a cheerful, "See you tomorrow," leaving Eleonora with the task of reviewing an urgent and highly complex case file. A case file that belonged to Damien. She was in the main conference room, the documents spread out across the vast, polished glass table, when he entered. The tension in the air, which had been a low hum all day, immediately spiked. He entered a moment later, closing the door with a quiet, definitive click that sounded like a chamber being locked, sealing them in together. He didn't speak at first, simply moved to the other side of the table, his presence filling the large room, making it feel small and claustrophobic. "Did you read the material?" he finally asked, his voice deep and impassive. "Yes," Eleonora answered, her own voice clear and professional, a small victory. "And with all due respect, Damien, I think your proposed strategy is too risky." His head came up at her use of his first name, a flicker of something, surprise, or perhaps satisfaction in his eyes. He crossed his arms over his powerful chest. "Too risky?" he repeated, his tone challenging. Holding his gaze, she pushed forward, her legal mind taking over, a welcome shield against the turmoil he created in her. Basing the entire defense solely on the presumption of good faith, without reinforcing the ancillary documentation, is fragile. The prosecutor is aggressive. He will tear that argument apart. For a long, unnerving moment, he just watched her, his expression unreadable. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, her argument, her intelligence, her very being dissected by his formidable mind. Then he moved. He walked slowly around the long table until he was standing directly behind her. He leaned his hands on the back of her chair, caging her in. "Are you teaching me how to build a case, Eleonora?" he asked, his voice a dangerously low murmur right beside her ear. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin. "No," she said, her spine stiffening, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm just doing my job." A humorless, almost cruel smile touched his lips. He leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower, a velvet growl that sent a shiver down her spine. "Your job is to learn," he countered, "to trust the experience of a man who was winning these kinds of battles while you were still learning to read textbooks." The condescending words cut deep, a deliberate jab at her youth and inexperience. She took a sharp, deep breath, fighting to maintain her composure. "Then maybe," she said, her own voice tight with suppressed anger, "I should just keep my opinions to myself and watch the master at work." He moved again, a subtle shift, but it was enough for the distance between them to completely evaporate. She could feel the hard, muscular length of his thigh pressing against the side of her chair, the heat of his body a palpable force. "Maybe," he murmured, his voice now thick with something other than professional irritation, something darker, more primal. "You should understand the difference between discussing a strategy and challenging the man who can teach you how to win." His eyes were burning into hers in the reflection of the dark window in front of them. Trembling inside, but refusing to back down, Eleonora met his gaze. "And maybe," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the charged silence, acutely, painfully aware of his proximity, "you should understand that just because you're the best doesn't mean you're always right." The tension in the room snapped. It was a tangible, audible thing like a high-tension wire breaking. For a heart-stopping, agonizing second, she was sure he was going to close the final inch between them, that he was going to turn her chair, pull her to him, and finally cross the line they both so desperately pretended still existed. Instead, a muscle in his jaw clenched violently. With an abrupt, almost violent gesture, he pushed away from her chair and snatched the file from the table. "You're dismissed for the day," he said, His voice clipped and harsh, not looking at her. Eleonora gathered her things, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely grasp her pen. As she walked out of the room, her head held high, she could feel his gaze burning into her back. The argument, the anger, the raw, undeniable desire that had pulsed beneath every word. It was no longer a question of if, it was only and ever a matter of when. The next morning, the office felt like a war zone in the aftermath of a silent, devastating battle. The air was thick and heavy, charged with the fallout from their confrontation. Eleonora arrived early, her eyes shadowed from a sleepless night. The argument with Damien kept replaying in her mind, a relentless loop of his condescending words, her own defiant whispers, and the searing, unspoken desire that had underscored every single moment. It was just a professional disagreement, she repeated to herself as she sat at her desk, the words a hollow, unconvincing lie. But deep down, in the most honest part of her soul, she knew that nothing between them would ever be just professional. She spent the morning in a haze, moving through quick meetings and answering emails with an automaton-like efficiency. She was a ghost in her own life, her body present but her mind and soul still trapped in that conference room with him. Around noon, just as she was considering forcing herself to eat lunch, he appeared at her open office door. He didn't knock, simply materialized in the doorway, a dark, imposing figure holding a single thin file. "We have a document review to complete before the end of the day," he said, his tone neutral, clipped, as if their explosive argument had never happened. But the tension that radiated from him, the rigid set of his shoulders, the hard line of his jaw, told a different story. He entered her office and, instead of sitting in one of the chairs opposite her desk, he pulled a small round support table from the corner of the room and placed it between their two chairs, creating a small, intensely intimate workspace. The documents were spread out, a fragile barrier of paper and ink between them. The trouble began almost immediately. He leaned in to point out a detail in a complex legal clause, his body moving into her personal space. Eleonora felt the subtle shift in the air, the displacement of oxygen as he drew near. She felt his warm breath ghost across her neck, slow, deliberate, dangerously intimate. The scent of him, a clean, masculine scent of expensive cologne, starched cotton, and something uniquely, intoxicatingly Damien, filled her senses, clouding her thoughts. A hot, unstoppable wave of blood rushed to her face, a betraying flush she prayed he wouldn't notice. She tried to shift away, a small, discreet movement, but in doing so the back of her hand brushed against his. The touch was accidental, a fleeting, incidental contact, but the effect was catastrophic. For less than a single second their skin met, and in that moment it was as if a powerful electrical current had been unleashed, igniting every nerve ending in its path. It was a jolt so powerful, so profound, it stole the breath from her lungs. She pulled her hand back as if she had been burned, a small sharp gasp escaping her lips. But it was too late. Her body had already betrayed her, and his had too. He lifted his eyes from the document, and the professional mask he wore so masterfully was gone. For a single shattering moment, the look they shared was stripped of all pretense. It was no longer the look of a boss and a subordinate. It was the look of a man and a woman, of raw, untamed desire and imminent risk, of a deep, insatiable hunger and a profound, terrifying fear. The air in the small office vibrated, the silence about to snap like a high-tension wire. And in that exact, impossibly charged instant, the door to her office swung open. Isabel entered, a cheerful whirlwind holding 2 large cups of coffee. "Hi, I brought some fuel for the—" Her bright, happy voice trailed off, dying in the supercharged air. She stopped abruptly just inside the doorway, her gaze darting from Eleonora's flushed, startled face to her father's rigid, unreadable posture, and back again. Her smile faltered. Her eyes, usually so bright and carefree, narrowed slightly with confusion. She couldn't have known what was happening, but she could feel it. She could feel the thick, unnatural tension in the room, even if she couldn't name what it was. Eleonora cleared her throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "Thanks, Isabel." Damien took the coffee from his daughter's hand without a word, his jaw tight, his expression a cold, impenetrable mask once more. Isabel forced a small, confused, almost uncomfortable smile. "Well," she said, her usual effervescence gone. "I'll let you two work." She backed slowly toward the door, her eyes still flickering between them, a question hanging in the air. When she was gone, the silence that fell over them was deafening, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Damien stood up abruptly, the movement sharp and jarring. He gathered the documents with a clipped, efficient motion. "We'll continue this after lunch," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder. And then he was gone. Eleonora was left there alone, her breath short, her hands trembling so violently she had to clench them into fists in her lap. It was no longer a silent war. It was no longer something they could control or conceal. The accidental touch had been a warning. The near miss had been a prelude. What came next would be impossible to contain. The following days were an exquisite form of torture, a cold war waged in stolen glances and clipped, necessary words. Eleonora tried to lose herself in her work, to build a fortress of legal briefs and case files around her heart, but she was aware of Damien's presence in every corner of the office. She could feel him even when she couldn't see him, a constant magnetic pull that her body couldn't or wouldn't ignore. That night, she stayed late, driven by a masochistic need to prove her worth, to prove that she was more than just the object of his forbidden desire. The office was nearly deserted, the usual hum of activity replaced by a deep, echoing silence. The corridors were plunged into shadow, the lights in most sections already turned off for the night. Isabel was out of the city, visiting clients for the firm, a fact that settled in Eleonora's mind with a dangerous weight. She wasn't surprised to find that Damien had also stayed. She saw the light on under his office door as she made her way to the conference room to finalize her work. It seemed they were the only two souls left in the entire skyscraper. The tension between them, which had been a low, constant hum for days, now felt like a palpable, living entity in the empty, silent space. She was reviewing a complex contract clause, her mind struggling to focus on the dense legal text, when she sensed him move. She didn't hear him approach. The plush carpet muffled his footsteps, but she felt a shift in the air, a subtle change in the pressure of the room. He came to stand behind her, leaning in close, ostensibly to point to something on the paper in front of her. His warm breath ghosted across the sensitive skin of her neck, a slow, deliberate caress. The scent of him, that intoxicating mix of scotch and power, enveloped her, and an involuntary shiver traced its way down the entire length of her spine. She closed her eyes for a single, fleeting second, a silent surrender to the overwhelming sensation of his proximity. When she turned her head just slightly, her face was inches from his. Too close. Dangerously, beautifully, terrifyingly close. For a heart-stopping moment, the entire world shrank to the charged millimeter of space between their mouths. His eyes, dark and turbulent, searched hers, and she saw in their depths the raw, undeniable truth of his own struggle, his own desperate hunger. And then in that moment all his legendary iron-willed control shattered. His hand came up, not gently, but with a raw, undeniable urgency, his fingers tangling in the soft hair at the nape of her neck, his touch both a caress and a claim. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a soft, hesitant kiss. It was a collision, a clash of mouths and wills, a desperate, hungry claiming, fueled by weeks of repressed, forbidden desire. Eleonora let out a low, helpless gasp, a sound he instantly swallowed as his tongue swept into her mouth, not asking but taking. It was a kiss of raw possession, of a hunger that had been starved for too long. The taste of him was intoxicating, a heady, dangerous mix of expensive scotch and pure, undiluted masculinity. Her own control, her own carefully constructed walls of professionalism and denial, crumbled to dust. Her hands flew up, her fingers digging into the fine, expensive fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer, desperate to eliminate the last remaining space between them. He groaned against her mouth, a rough, guttural sound of a man surrendering to his most basic, primal instincts. His other hand clamped onto her waist, his grip strong and sure, and he lifted her effortlessly from the chair, pressing her body hard against the unyielding length of his. He was solid, hot, relentless. The kiss grew deeper, harder, more desperate. It was no longer just a kiss. It was a battle, a punishment, a release. It was anger and need, guilt and ecstasy, everything they had tried to suffocate now exploding between them in the raw, visceral language of the flesh. When Damien finally, reluctantly broke the kiss, he did so slowly, resting his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in ragged, frantic gasps. For a long, stunned moment, the only sound in the dark, silent conference room was the wild, frantic hammering of their hearts, beating in a chaotic, synchronized rhythm. "Eleonora," he murmured, his voice broken, ravaged, thick with the aftermath of their shared inferno. She kept her eyes closed, her senses completely overwhelmed. The taste of him was still on her lips, a phantom throb. The brand of his touch was still burning her skin. The scent of him was in her lungs. "I know," she whispered back, the words a soft, shaky admission. There was no room for apologies, no space for regret. There was only the visceral, undeniable truth of what had just happened. He took a difficult, ragged step back, his eyes dark with a turbulent storm of warring emotions. "Go home," he commanded, his voice strained, hoarse. Eleonora nodded, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely gather her things. She walked out of the room without looking back, but every nerve ending in her body screamed at his absence. Every single beat of her heart was an echo of that kiss, and she knew with a certainty that both terrified and thrilled her to the very core of her being that there was no turning back. What they had done, what they had allowed to happen, had changed the world forever. The days that followed the kiss were an exquisite form of torture. The office, once a symbol of her ambition and future, transformed into a landscape of unbearable tension. Every corridor felt too long, every room too small, every ticking clock a countdown to another moment of fraught, impossible proximity. Eleonora arrived before the sun rose and left long after it had set, immersing herself in the driest, most complex case files she could find. She built a fortress around herself with walls of paper and ink, a desperate, futile attempt to create a space where the memory of his touch, the taste of his lips, couldn't reach her. Damien, it seemed, was engaged in the same silent, desperate war. He became a ghost in his own firm. A powerful, brooding presence felt more than seen. The door to his corner office remained perpetually closed. He took meetings by video conference, communicated with his senior partners via terse, efficient emails, and moved through the hallways with a swift, purposeful stride that discouraged any and all casual interaction. They existed in the same building, on the same floor. Two celestial bodies locked in a painful gravitational orbit, close enough to feel the undeniable pull, but forcing themselves to maintain a torturous, unnatural distance. It was an uncomfortable, unspoken dance of silences and pretenses, a cold war waged in stolen, fleeting glances across a crowded boardroom and clipped, brutally professional words exchanged only when absolutely necessary. But the forced distance didn't extinguish the fire that had been unleashed in that dark conference room. It was like starving a flame of oxygen. It didn't put it out. It only made it burn hotter, brighter, more dangerous, deep within the hidden corners of their souls. Inside Eleonora, a battle raged. One part of her, the logical, ambitious lawyer she had always been, was screaming at the sheer, catastrophic recklessness of her actions. She had jeopardized her career, her future, and most painfully, her friendship with Isabel, the one constant, unwavering light in her life. The guilt was a physical weight, a constant ache in her chest that made it hard to breathe. But another part of her, a wild, untamed part she was only just beginning to know, replayed the kiss on an endless, intoxicating loop. She remembered the raw, desperate hunger in his touch, the way his control had shattered, the groan that had been torn from his throat. She remembered the feeling of being utterly, completely consumed, of being seen and wanted in a way that went beyond mere physical attraction. And that part of her, the reckless, shameless part, craved it with an intensity that terrified her. Damien, on the other side of the office, was no better. Locked in his silent, glass-walled sanctuary, he drowned himself in work, pushing himself and his team to the brink. It was a frantic, desperate attempt to outrun his own thoughts, to fill every waking moment with enough pressure and complexity to crowd out the image of her. Anything not to think about her. Anything not to give in to the primal, overwhelming urge to cross the hall, to close the door to her office, and to do what his body, his very soul, screamed to do. He hated it. He hated his own weakness, this inexplicable, all-consuming vulnerability she had exposed in him. He, Damien Sterling, a man who moved markets, who crushed opponents without a second thought, who had built an empire on a foundation of iron-willed control, was being undone by a pair of intelligent, challenging eyes and a mouth that had tasted of forbidden promises. He hated how just catching a fleeting glimpse of her from a distance, her head bent in concentration over her desk, the elegant curve of her neck, the way she chewed on the end of her pen when she was deep in thought, was enough to make his carefully constructed control unravel like sand in the tide. Eleonora Lancaster was destroying him, and he didn't know how to go back to being the man he had always been. Isabel, oblivious to the depth and nature of the cataclysm that had occurred, but far too perceptive not to notice the fallout, began to worry. The easy, comfortable dynamic of their small team had vanished, replaced by a strange, formal chill. On a Friday afternoon, a week after the kiss, she appeared in Eleonora's office doorway, holding 2 large mugs of coffee, her expression a mixture of concern and confusion. "Hey," she said softly, entering with a tentative smile. "I'm officially ordering you to take a break. You're working like the world is about to end." Eleonora forced a laugh, the sound thin and brittle to her own ears. "Just a lot of deadlines," she answered, her gaze fixed on the document on her screen, unable to meet her friend's eyes. Isabel sat down in the chair across from her desk, her presence filling the room with a warmth that made Eleonora's guilt feel even colder and sharper. "And my dad?" she asked, her voice casual but her eyes sharp, observant. "He seems different, doesn't he? More tense, more withdrawn than I've ever seen him. I thought maybe you two had a disagreement over a case or something. Was he too hard on you? Did you fight?" The directness of the question was like a physical blow. Eleonora's head snapped up, her denial too quick, too vehement. "No, of course not. It was nothing. Just work. You know how he is. He's demanding. He always has been." Isabel seemed to accept the answer, or perhaps she simply chose to. "Yeah," she sighed, stirring her coffee. "He's always been kind of intense about everything. Sometimes it seems like he's carrying the whole world on his shoulders." Eleonora gave a slight, non-committal smile, unable to say more because in that moment she felt like she was carrying a world too, a secret, heavy world made of contained desire, of suffocating guilt, of a desperate, insatiable hunger. And it was becoming clearer and clearer with every passing silent day. The distance they were so desperately trying to impose between them wasn't a cure. It was a slow, insidious poison. A few nights later, Moretti and Associates hosted an elegant cocktail party at a sophisticated Beverly Hills hotel to celebrate the firm's recent expansion. It was a command performance, an evening designed to solidify partnerships with old clients, to introduce new talent, and to reinforce the solid, impeccable image that Damien Sterling was so notoriously careful to maintain. Eleonora arrived with Isabel, wearing an elegant but deliberately discreet black dress. A suit of armor for the battle of nerves she knew was coming. She tried to appear confident, to project an air of calm professionalism, but she knew that somewhere in that glittering, crowded ballroom he was already waiting, and the tension between them hadn't been erased. It was merely dormant, a sleeping volcano waiting for the right moment to erupt. They met in the middle of the ballroom, the encounter as inevitable as gravity. He was in a tailored black suit, a vision of dark, masculine power, his gaze serious and intense as he navigated a conversation with a wealthy client. He saw her approaching, and for a fleeting, unguarded moment, his professional mask slipped, and she saw a flash of the same raw hunger that had consumed them in the conference room. They exchanged a brief, formal greeting, their voices polite, their words cold, their glances hot enough to melt steel. "Eleonora, good to see you," he said, his voice a smooth, deep baritone. "Mr. Sterling," she replied, her own voice cool and steady. She moved away as quickly as she could without being rude, feigning a distraction, but with every step she took, she felt the invisible, possessive weight of his gaze fixed on her back. Hours later, when the atmosphere was more relaxed, a group of influential clients gathered around Damien, discussing strategies for a new, high-stakes merger. It was then that Eleonora, driven by a sudden, reckless impulse to prove she was more than just a distraction, to prove she belonged there on her own merit, offered her opinion. "I understand the traditional strategy," she said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the low murmur of conversation. But perhaps we should consider including an environmental compliance and sustainability clause. In the current market, it could be a significant competitive differentiator. For a second, the entire group fell silent. All eyes turned to her. Damien stared at her, his expression unreadable, his gaze cold, controlled. "I appreciate your opinion, Eleonora," he said, his tone so excessively polite it was insulting. "But in this case, conservatism is what protects the client, not innovation." The words were professional, but the subtext was a public, brutal dismissal. He was putting her back in her place, reminding her and everyone else of the hierarchy. Eleonora felt the blow like a physical slap, but she maintained her serene smile, her composure a fragile, perfect mask. "Of course," she replied, stepping back slightly, melting back into the crowd. Isabel, distracted in another conversation, didn't notice the tense, humiliating exchange. But for Eleonora and Damien, it was more than a simple disagreement. It was a fissure, a deep, gaping crack in the fragile, paper-thin control they were so desperately trying to maintain. The cocktail party ended. Eleonora, her face a mask of polite smiles, grabbed her purse from the table and slipped out of the ballroom discreetly through a side corridor, desperate for air, for escape. The sound of her heels echoed on the cool, light marble of the empty hallway. She heard the footsteps behind her before she saw him. She felt him, a shift in the air, a familiar, dangerous presence that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. Her own body had warned her. It was him. "Eleonora," Damien called, his voice low, hoarse, a predator's growl in the quiet corridor. She stopped, her back to him, taking a single, fortifying second before she turned to face him. He was already close, his large frame blocking the light from the ballroom, casting him in shadow. "Why are you running from me?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous accusation. Eleonora bit her lower lip, her eyes shining with a sudden, hot moisture. "I'm not running," she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. He took a single, deliberate step forward, closing half the distance between them. "You can't even look at me," he stated, his voice a low, rough growl. She lifted her gaze then, her chin held high in a defiant gesture. "And you?" she retorted, her own voice cracking with the strain of all her pent-up emotion. "Can you stand there and act as if nothing happened between us?" His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching violently in his cheek. "I'm trying," he said, his voice deep, torn, the sound of a man being ripped in two. A low, broken, humorless laugh escaped her lips, and a single hot tear finally escaped, tracing a silent path down her cheek. "Trying," she whispered, the word laced with a week's worth of pain and confusion. "You confuse me, Damien. You pull me in, and then you push me away. You look at me like you're going to devour me whole, and then you humiliate me in front of your clients and pretend I'm just another employee." He took another step, his composure finally, completely unraveling. The cool, controlled titan was gone, and in his place was a broken, desperate man. His gaze, so cold just moments before, was now filled with a raw, agonizing torment. "I shouldn't," he began, his voice failing him. "But you want to," Eleonora finished for him, her voice a wounded, knowing whisper. He closed his eyes for an instant, a flicker of profound pain crossing his features. "I tried, Eleonora. I swear to God I tried. I tried to stay away, to be the right man, to do the right thing for everyone." He moved closer still, so close now that she could feel the heat rolling off his body in waves, so close she could see the flecks of silver in his stormy grey eyes. "But every time I look at you," his voice dropped to a desperate, ragged murmur, "I forget everything. I forget who I am. I forget what I'm supposed to do. I only see you." "I can't take it anymore," she whispered, her own defenses crumbling to dust. He slowly, hesitantly raised his hand and touched her face, his thumb gently, reverently, brushing away the single tear on her cheek. The tenderness of the gesture, so at odds with the powerful, ruthless man she knew him to be, shattered the last of her resolve. And in that instant, there was no more room for resistance, no more space for fear, no more capacity for reason. There was only the pain, the desire, the raw, uncontrollable, undeniable need to find themselves, to lose themselves in each other. The instant his thumb brushed against her tear-streaked cheek, the fragile dam holding back weeks of repressed emotion didn't just break. It completely disintegrated. The tenderness of that single, gentle touch was more undoing than any act of aggression could ever have been. It was an admission of his own vulnerability, a silent confession that he was just as lost in this impossible storm as she was. And in that shared moment of raw, unguarded honesty, there was no more room for resistance, no more space for fear, no more capacity for reason. There was only the primal, undeniable truth of their connection, a force of nature that had finally, inevitably, overwhelmed them both. He pulled her to him, not with a gentle invitation, but with a desperate, all-consuming urgency, as if he were a drowning man reaching for his only source of air. His mouth crashed down on hers, and it wasn't a kiss. It was a conflagration. It was the raw, unrestrained release of every stolen glance, every unspoken word, every moment of agonizing proximity. It was hunger and anger, pain and pleasure, a love so undeclared and forbidden it was agonizing. His hands framed her face, his grip firm, almost bruising, as if he were afraid she might vanish into thin air, a beautiful, torturous mirage. His thumbs traced the sharp line of her cheekbones, his touch both a caress and a claim. Eleonora responded with the same fierce, desperate intensity, her own control shattering into a million pieces. Her hands flew up, her fingers tangling in the thick, silver-streaked hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer, deeper, trying to erase the last agonizing millimeter of space between them. Their mouths opened, their tongues meeting in a wet, hot, desperate dance. It was a kiss of raw possession, a visceral, non-negotiable claiming. She could taste the expensive scotch on his tongue, a smoky, peaty flavor that mingled with the pure, undiluted taste of him, a flavor she knew she would be addicted to for the rest of her life. When they finally reluctantly broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads pressed together, their eyes closed, adrift in the chaotic, beautiful aftermath. They both knew with a terrifying, exhilarating certainty that there was no going back. What they had built in silences and stolen glances, in professional arguments and accidental touches, now burned between them like a supernova. And even if the whole world with all its rules and judgments stood against them, in that instant there were only the two of them. Eleonora's breath still came in ragged, painful gasps. The quiet, sterile hotel corridor was plunged into a heavy, intimate silence, broken only by the frantic, synchronized rhythm of their hearts, foreheads still pressed together, eyes still closed, the glittering world of the cocktail party, of their careers, of their responsibilities seemed to have disappeared completely. There was only him, the solid, warm strength of his body pressed against hers. There was only her, the soft, trembling surrender of her body in his arms. Damien slid his fingers from her hair down the long, elegant line of her neck, his touch leaving a trail of fire on her skin. He lingered for a moment on the frantic, fluttering pulse at the base of her throat, a silent acknowledgement of the profound effect he had on her. His eyes, when they finally opened to meet hers, burned with a potent, overwhelming mix of raw desire, profound fear, and a startling, beautiful surrender. His voice, when it came, was a raw, broken whisper, heavy with everything that had been trapped between them for weeks. "I want you, Eleonora." The three simple words were stripped of all pretense, of all his usual armor. It was a confession, a plea, a declaration of defeat from a man who had never lost a battle in his life. She held her breath, her heart stumbling in her chest, her soul laid bare before him. He didn't press, didn't move, just let the brutal, honest confession hang in the air between them. And then, in a murmur that was almost a prayer, a sound so full of vulnerability it made her own heart ache, he asked, "Do you want me?" The tears that had been burning in her eyes for days finally fell, hot and silent. They were tears for everything, for the agonizing waiting, for the suffocating fear, for the insatiable hunger, for the beautiful, catastrophic truth she could no longer deny to him or to herself. "Yes," she answered, her voice choked, raw, and absolutely real. "God, yes." Damien closed his eyes for a second, a shudder racking his powerful frame, as if her answer was the only thing holding him upright, the only thing keeping him from shattering completely. When he opened them again, his gaze was clear, resolved. He rested his forehead against hers one last time. "Do you trust me?" he asked, his voice thick with an emotion far greater, far deeper than just desire. Eleonora didn't need words. Her answer was in the way she rose onto her toes and kissed him again. It wasn't a desperate, hungry kiss like before. This was a soft, deep, languid kiss, full of a silent, profound surrender. It was the kiss of a woman choosing her fate, of a soul recognizing its counterpart, regardless of the risks, regardless of the consequences. When they broke apart, still breathing the same air, their bodies still humming with the aftershocks of their confession, Damien pulled his phone from his pocket with a steady hand. He made a single, quick call, his eyes never leaving hers. "The penthouse. Now," he said into the phone, his voice a low, firm command that tolerated no questions. He hung up without waiting for a reply. Then he took her hand, his large, warm hand enveloping hers, his grip both firm and careful, as if she were the most precious, most fragile thing in the world. And together, in a shared, silent understanding, they walked to the private elevator at the end of the hall. The ascent was silent, every second stretched to an eternity. They didn't speak, didn't look at each other. They simply stood side by side, their hands clasped tightly, the only sound the soft hum of the elevator and their own heavy breathing. When the doors opened with a soft chime onto a private, marble-floored foyer, he guided her down a quiet, empty corridor to a heavy, dark wooden door at the very end. The dry, definitive click of the electronic lock disengaging seemed to echo in the very core of Eleonora's chest. The door swung open, and they were inside. The penthouse suite was a masterpiece of understated luxury. It was vast, lit by warm, soft, indirect lights that cast a golden glow on the expensive art and minimalist furniture. But Eleonora saw none of it. She only saw Damien, and the way he looked at her as he closed and locked the door behind them, as if she were the only thing that existed, the only thing that mattered in the entire universe. He moved toward her slowly, his eyes locked on hers, a silent, deliberate predator closing in on his willing prey. He gave her every chance to retreat, to change her mind, to run. But Eleonora didn't move an inch. She stood her ground in the center of the vast living room, her heart pounding a wild, exhilarating rhythm, a silent, defiant answer to the question he had asked her in the corridor. "Yes, I trust you." When he finally reached her, he didn't kiss her. He simply touched her, his warm palm cupping her face, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her jaw. A shudder of pure, unadulterated pleasure ran through her entire body at the simple, reverent touch. He kissed her again then, a kiss with no hesitation, no doubt, only absolute certainty. He pulled her flush against him, her soft curves molding against his hard, muscular frame, their bodies fitting together as if they had been carved from the same stone, destined for this moment. With a calm, reverent deliberation that was somehow more sensual than any frantic haste could ever be, he began to undress her. His skilled fingers found the hidden zipper on the back of her emerald dress, and he drew it down slowly, inch by agonizing inch, the soft sound a counterpoint to the frantic beating of her heart. The silk whispered as it slid from her shoulders, pooling in a shimmering heap at her feet. With every button he undid, every piece of delicate fabric that slid over her skin, Eleonora felt her own breath catch, her own control slipping away. He followed the path of newly exposed skin with his lips, her shoulder, her collarbone, the delicate, fluttering pulse at the base of her throat, the subtle, shadowy path down the center of her chest, with an almost cruel, exquisitely torturous slowness. When she stood naked before him, bathed in the soft golden light of the room, the look in his eyes as they swept over every line, every curve of her body, was one of such raw, unadulterated adoration that all her remaining fear, all her remaining guilt, simply evaporated into nothing. In his eyes she was not forbidden, she was not wrong, she was beautiful, she was his. He undressed himself without hurry, his eyes never leaving hers, a silent, powerful promise in their depths. When they were finally skin to skin, the contact was a jolt of pure elemental electricity. Eleonora gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to rest on the hot, solid wall of his chest. His body was a landscape of hard muscle and warm skin, a potent, intoxicating reality after weeks of fantasy and longing. He was a man made to command, a man made to dominate, a man who was now, impossibly, completely hers. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her into the bedroom. He laid her on the vast, soft bed, the cool, high thread count sheets a stark contrast to the heat of her skin. He came over her, caging her in with his powerful arms, and kissed her again, deeper this time, hungrier, stronger. His hand slid down her body, over the flat plane of her stomach, lower, his fingers tangling in the soft curls at the apex of her thighs, his touch both a question and a command. His knee parted hers with a gentle, dominant intimacy, opening her to him. When he entered her, it was with a slow, deliberate, almost reverent movement. He gave her time to adjust, to feel, to open, to let the reality of their union happen completely. Eleonora cried out softly, her eyes filling with tears, not of pain, but of a profound, overwhelming emotion she couldn't name. Damien groaned low against her ear, a rough, guttural sound, as if he too were fighting for control against the sheer, agonizing pleasure of their connection. He began to move inside her, a steady, powerful, precise rhythm. Each movement was deep, intense, purposeful. His body dominated hers completely, but with a strength that felt like protection, not force, a possession that felt like worship. Eleonora lost herself in the intensity, in the heat, in the scent of his skin, in the primal, rhythmic sound of their bodies meeting. The desire built inside her like a tidal wave, gathering strength, climbing higher and higher, about to crest. He looked deep into her eyes as he moved, his own gaze raw, vulnerable, filled with a surrender she never knew he possessed, filled with something she knew, with an unshakable certainty, was love, even if neither of them dared to speak its name. When they finally reached the peak together, it was a shattering, soul-altering release. Eleonora cried out his name, her body arching against his as her world dissolved into blinding white waves of pure, ecstatic sensation. Damien grunted, a rough, guttural sound of pure release, pulling her impossibly closer, as if to merge their very souls into a single being before finding his own release inside her. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, their bodies slick with sweat, their breathing heavy and ragged in the quiet, shadowed room. Eleonora's heart beat erratically against his solid, slowly steadying chest. He held her tightly, his large hand stroking her back in slow, soothing, possessive movements. He kissed the top of her head, his lips soft against her damp hair, and said in a broken, raw whisper, "Now you're mine. You always were." Eleonora closed her eyes, and there, in his arms, in the safe, quiet aftermath of the storm, she felt for the very first time in her life that she belonged. The world outside the penthouse suite continued to spin on its axis. The city of Los Angeles glittered below them, a sprawling, indifferent galaxy of lights, its inhabitants living out their own dramas, blissfully unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred on the 35th floor of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. But inside the vast, quiet bedroom, time had stopped. The room was plunged into a soft, intimate shadow, the only light the distant, muted glow of the city filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Eleonora lay with her head resting on Damien's solid chest, her ear pressed against the steady, rhythmic sound of his heart. It was the most calming, most grounding sound she had ever heard. With every deep, even beat, she felt the chaotic, frantic energy that had consumed her for weeks begin to recede, replaced by a profound, bone-deep sense of peace. She knew, with a certainty that resonated in every fiber of her being, that nothing would ever be the same after this night. She had crossed a line, and in doing so she had not fallen into an abyss, but had instead found the one place she was always meant to be. This man, her best friend's father, her formidable boss, the forbidden, impossible man, was now etched into the very fabric of her soul in a way that no distance, no fear, no guilt could ever erase. Damien's arm was a heavy, protective weight around her, holding her close as if he were afraid she might disappear with the morning light. He slowly, gently, ran his hand through her tangled hair, the repetitive, soothing motion a silent language of possession and care. "Eleonora," he whispered into the quiet, his voice a low, rough murmur against her hair. She lifted her face from his chest to meet his gaze. In the dim light, his eyes, usually so sharp and intimidating, were soft, dark, and serious. For a long, silent moment, they just looked at each other. There were no masks, no professional pretenses, no carefully constructed walls between them. There was no way back. There was only the raw, undeniable truth of what they had become to each other. Damien slid his hand from her hair to cup her face, his thumb stroking the soft curve of her cheek. It was a gesture so full of a quiet, reverent tenderness, it made Eleonora's chest ache with an emotion so powerful it felt like pain. There were no formal, flowery promises of forever spoken aloud, no declarations of undying love. But in that moment, in the profound, eloquent silence between them, there was a truth more powerful than any words could ever be. It was a truth carved into their skin by the heat of their touches, into their blood by the frantic rhythm of their shared climax, into their souls by the silent recognition of a kindred spirit. And that truth was absolute, non-negotiable. He leaned down and kissed her again, a slow, deep, languid kiss that was vastly different from the desperate, hungry kisses they had shared before. This was a kiss of quiet promises, of a future an hour ago she hadn't dared to imagine. It was a kiss that tasted of acceptance, of homecoming. When they finally broke apart, he wrapped her in his arms once more, pulling the soft, luxurious duvet over their still entwined bodies. Eleonora sighed, a soft, contented sound, and nestled deeper against him, finally allowing the bone-deep exhaustion of the past few weeks to claim her. She knew the world outside, with all its complications and consequences, still existed. She knew there would be difficult conversations, fears to be faced, and perhaps even pain to be endured. But in that moment, in that bed, in that warm, absolute silence, wrapped in the arms of the man who had become her entire world, nothing else mattered. Only them, only the beautiful, dangerous, breathtaking thing they had created in the forbidden space between right and wrong. What had been born between them in restrained glances, in accidental touches, in desperate, soul-shattering kisses, was now a living, breathing part of them, inseparable, indestructible. Months passed. The initial explosive passion did not fade, but instead settled into the deep, steady embers of a profound and unshakable love. They learned to navigate their new reality with a careful, intricate grace. At the gleaming, glass-walled offices of Sterling and Associates in Century City, they maintained their professional roles with a discipline that bordered on artistry. He was Damien Sterling, the formidable founding partner. She was Eleonora Lancaster, his brilliant, indispensable associate. Their interactions were crisp, efficient, and impeccably professional. But beneath the surface of every formal meeting, a secret, silent conversation was always taking place. It was in the fleeting, private smiles they exchanged when no one else was looking. It was in the way his gaze would linger on her for a fraction of a second too long when she was presenting a case, a look of pure, unadulterated pride in his eyes. It was in the way her heart would skip a beat when she would hear his deep, resonant voice in the corridor. It was in the stolen, all too brief touches of their hands as they passed a file, a touch that sent a jolt of electricity through them both. It was in the late nights they spent working side by side in his office, the air thick with an intimacy that was far more potent than any physical act. Their love story was written in the margins of legal briefs, in the silent spaces between spoken words, a beautiful secret script that only they could read. And Isabel, the bright, beautiful soul who stood at the very center of their impossible situation, had in her own quiet, perceptive way, always known. Perhaps she had known from the very beginning, from that first charged night at the graduation party. She noticed it in the gazes that tried so hard to be restrained, but were always, inevitably, drawn to each other across a crowded room. She noticed it in the spontaneous smiles that would escape their lips without permission when one of them would enter a room. She noticed it in the long, unexplained absences from social events, in the new, quiet light of happiness in her father's eyes, a light she hadn't seen since before her parents' separation. But she never asked, never confronted, never demanded an explanation. She simply watched, and in her heart, she understood. Deep down, she was rooting for them. She knew her father, a man who had been encased in a fortress of loneliness and responsibility for so long, deserved to be truly happy. And she knew that Eleonora, her brilliant, serious, beautiful best friend, was the only person in the world capable of making him truly, genuinely smile. On a golden late summer afternoon, Damien prepared a surprise. He drove Eleonora up the coast to a small secluded restaurant in Malibu, a hidden gem perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean, nestled among windswept cypress trees and the intoxicating scent of sea salt. The ocean crashed against the rocks below, the wind tousled her hair, and for a moment, the complicated world of law firms and secret relationships seemed very, very far away. Between a sip of crisp, cold white wine and a shared, lingering smile across the candle-lit table, Damien reached out and took her hand. The simple, public gesture was a profound declaration in itself. He looked deep into her eyes, his own gaze clear, serious, and stripped of all its usual armor. He hadn't rehearsed what he was about to say, hadn't planned it. He simply spoke the truth that had become the new center of his universe. "I don't want to live without you anymore, Eleonora," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I don't want to hide in the shadows. I don't want stolen moments. I want a lifetime of them. I want everything with you." Eleonora held her breath, her heart seeming to stop and then restart in her chest, a warm, powerful wave of emotion washing over her. Damien squeezed her hand, a rare, almost shy smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Will you be my girlfriend?" he asked. The formal, almost boyish question so at odds with the powerful, confident man he was that it made her heart ache with love. She let out a soft, muffled, emotional laugh, her eyes shining with tears. "You still have to ask?" she whispered. He smiled wider then, a real, genuine smile that lit up his entire face, and in that moment, she knew she was looking at the man she would love for the rest of her life. She answered without a single hesitation, her voice clear and strong. "Of course, yes." Damien lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of old-world chivalry, as if sealing a silent, sacred promise. There, amidst the smell of the sea, the warmth of the setting sun, and the profound, unshakable certainty that only true love can give, Eleonora knew. This wasn't just a passionate affair. It wasn't a mistake or a temporary madness. It was the beginning of something no one, not even the world with all its judgments, could ever destroy. A few days later, they decided to tell Isabel, not because they were afraid, but because she was the most important person in both of their lives, and she deserved the respect of the truth spoken aloud. On a quiet, sun-drenched morning on the terrace of the Malibu beach house, Damien called his daughter over to talk. Eleonora sat beside him, her hand held tightly in his, her heart pounding with a nervous but hopeful rhythm. Isabel looked from her father to her best friend, at their clasped hands, at the new, serene happiness in their eyes, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face before either of them had spoken a single word. "Do you guys honestly think you've been fooling me this whole time?" she said, crossing her arms and feigning a look of severity that was betrayed by the joyful sparkle in her eyes. Eleonora blushed, a wave of relief so profound it almost made her dizzy. Damien let out a low, rumbling laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness. "We wanted to do things the right way," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Isabel shook her head, her own laughter bubbling up. "The right way for you two was always going to be your own way," she said wisely. "I already knew. I was just waiting for you both to be brave enough to admit it. I just want you to be happy." Then, looking directly at Eleonora, her best friend, her sister, she added with a soft, genuine warmth, "You deserve all the happiness in the world, Ellie." Eleonora felt her eyes fill with tears, not of sadness or guilt, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude for the beautiful, accepting soul of her friend. Some stories are born in the silence of stolen glances. They grow in the forbidden, fertile ground of what should not be. And even when they are surrounded by a world of impossibilities, of judgments, of fear, they still, sometimes, against all odds, win. Because when love is real, when it is this powerful, this true, it doesn't need to ask for permission. It simply finds a way. If this story touched your heart, comment below where you're watching from and leave a like. And please, subscribe to the channel to experience many more emotions with us.